March 1943, North Atlantic. A dark, choppy sea. The U-boat crew feels the familiar weight of the waves. Their engines hum, vibrating through the hull. For months, they've been the predators of the deep, their movements unseen, their strikes deadly. They'll never find us, the captain thinks, gazing at the sonar screen. It's a routine operation, another stretch of water, another patrol. But then, a sudden, sharp crack, the first Hedgehog mortar explodes beneath them. The U-boat shudders violently, water rushing in through cracks. The crew barely has time to react. Another explosion, and then another. The once proud predator is now the hunted. The captain reaches for the intercom to shout an order, but his hand never makes it. The control room is filled with the roar of water flooding in, the frantic chatter of his crew now drowned out by the deep, gurgling chaos. No radio call, no order, just heat. The U-boat crests momentarily, its body torn apart by the shock waves. Silence settles over the crew, the sea swallowing their screams. The legend of the unstoppable U-boat is gone in an instant. And with that single strike, the myth of German supremacy beneath the waves is shattered. By early 1943, the tide of the war was beginning to turn, but not for the Germans. The Third Reich was facing an inevitable collapse, though its commanders still clung to a fading sense of superiority. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet forces were regaining ground, while in the West, the Allies were preparing for a long-awaited invasion of Europe. But in the North Atlantic, where the U-boat war was still the backbone of Germany's maritime strategy, the battle was far from decided. The U-boat fleet, once the terror of the high seas, had been striking at will, sinking merchant ships and military convoys vital to Britain's survival. The British, along with their American counterparts, were struggling to adapt to the onslaught. But the Allies were learning fast, and in the shadows of this deadly cat-and-mouse game, a new weapon was born, the Hedgehog. At first, the Germans had no reason to believe their tactics would fail. The U-boat was the ultimate weapon of war beneath the waves. With its advanced sonar, stealthy profile, and long-range torpedoes, it was a killer on its own terms. The U-boats had wreaked havoc on Allied supply lines, and as far as the German High Command was concerned, the balance of power under the sea was still theirs to control. The Allies, however, had learned a harsh truth. Victory would not come through sheer defense. The sheer size of the U-boat threat demanded a counterattack. The Hedgehog, a spigot mortar designed to fire 24 spiked grenades in quick succession, was developed as the solution. Its purpose, to give surface ships a chance to strike back with devastating power before the U-boat could escape. This new weapon marked a dramatic shift in the battle for the Atlantic. For the Germans, however, the myth of the invincible U-boat had created a dangerous complacency. The crew of each submarine, often arrogantly confident, was accustomed to hunting with impunity, expecting the next Allied convoy to fall victim to their ambush. They believed they were still the kings of the sea, that nothing could threaten their dominance. And yet, in the brutal reality of 1943, the tide was starting to change. The stakes were higher than ever. If the U-boat fleet couldn't maintain its advantage, if this new weapon could find them, the balance of the war could shift once and for all. The U-boats represented Germany's last line of defense in the Atlantic, and with the Allies pushing harder, the question was no longer if the U-boats could be defeated, but when. For the Allies, the Hedgehog was not just a new weapon. It was a game changer, a chance to finally stand toe-to-toe with their once unstoppable foe. But this new weapon wasn't just about technology, it was about strategy. The Germans' belief in their superiority was crumbling, and with every sinking U-boat, the myth of German invincibility slipped further into the abyss. This wasn't just a battle for control of the seas, it was a battle for the very survival of the Reich's dominance over the Atlantic. As the Allies adapted to the changing tides of war, the question that loomed over the Atlantic was stark. Could the German U-boat fleet survive the next wave of Allied innovations? The stakes were now higher than ever, and in the icy waters of the North Atlantic, there was no room for error. The outcome of this new phase of warfare would determine the fate of the U-boat campaign, and ultimately, the direction of the war itself. The U-boat was a powerful and fearsome weapon, unmatched in its ability to sink merchant vessels and cripple supply lines. At the heart of the U-boat's success was its stealth. Capable of submerging to depths of up to 500 meters, Its sonar and periscope systems allowed it to stalk its prey with terrifying efficiency. A U-boat could remain submerged for days, lurking unseen, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Its torpedoes could travel long distances and hit with pinpoint accuracy, making it a near impossible target for the Allies until the very last moment. Yet, despite all its sophistication, the U-boat had its vulnerabilities. These boats were powered by a combination of diesel engines for surface travel and electric motors for submerged operations. The transition between the two, though seemingly minor, left an opening. When a U-boat surfaced to recharge its batteries, it exposed itself, often leaving its crew exposed to detection by the Allies' growing fleet of surface ships and aircraft. In 1943, however, the Allies were catching up quickly. The Hedgehog, a newly developed anti-submarine weapon, was about to change the course of the war beneath the waves. The Hedgehog was a spigot mortar designed to fire 24 explosive charges over a wide area. It didn't rely on sonar or pinpoint accuracy like torpedoes, but instead used a rapid-fire salvo of small, contact-detonated bombs. It was designed to overwhelm the U-boat's defenses, making it difficult for the sub to evade the attack. What made the Hedgehog especially dangerous was its ability to deploy over a wide area. Unlike traditional depth charges that dropped one by one, the Hedgehog launched multiple grenades in one rapid salvo, creating a much larger target area. This meant that even if the U-boat could evade one or two of the explosions, the sheer volume of ordnance was likely to find its mark. The launchers themselves were mounted on the bows of Allied warships, designed to fire the mortars ahead of the ship. These were typically fitted to destroyers, corvettes, and even larger vessels, allowing them to make their attacks with speed and precision. Upon impact with the water, the grenades would sink rapidly and then detonate on contact with the U-boat's hull or near its pressure hull. The explosions could rupture the hull, cause flooding, or even destroy the boat outright. In some cases, the shock waves would be so intense that the U-boat crew had little to no time to react. The Hedgehog's advantage over conventional depth charges was its ability to hit a submerged U-boat directly. Depth charges, while powerful, relied on the U-boat being at a certain depth for the explosion to be effective. U-boats could adjust their depth, potentially avoiding the blast. But with the Hedgehog, the attack was not so easily avoided. It would cover a wide area, and the depth of the submarine became irrelevant. The explosion could break apart even the most durable hulls, especially the older models. Additionally, the speed at which a ship could launch the Hedgehog meant that the U-boat didn't have time to escape. In the past, a U-boat crew could detect an incoming attack with enough time to maneuver out of the blast zone. But the rapid-fire nature of the Hedgehog meant that, for the first time, U-boat crews were left with little room to react. The effectiveness of the Hedgehog was quickly proven in practice. In the first year of its use, it sank several high-value U-boats, including the infamous U-560, which was destroyed by a single Hedgehog attack. It marked the first time that Allied forces were able to reliably strike back against the U-boat threat with such precision and frequency. However, the German fleet was not without its response. In the wake of this new weapon, the Germans made adjustments, but they were fighting a losing battle. The U-boat's primary strength, its stealth, was now being countered by a weapon that didn't require precise targeting. The Allies had found a way to level the playing field. The next step for the Germans would be to adapt, but even they knew it was becoming increasingly difficult to hold on to their dominance in the North Atlantic. As the war continued, the presence of the Hedgehog in Allied convoys meant that U-boats no longer had the same advantage in open waters. The Allies' increased use of radar and improved sonar capabilities meant that the U-boat's once untouchable role was being slowly eroded. And as the Allies perfected the use of the Hedgehog, they were able to eliminate the very threat that had once been seen as invincible. The U-boat, despite its strength and capabilities, had finally met its match. Inside the cramped, dimly lit control room of U-221, the hum of the engine was the only sound that kept the crew tethered to the reality of the hunt. It was the familiar rhythm of war at sea. The air was thick with diesel fumes, and the constant vibration of the ship as it cut through the cold, dark Atlantic waters. The U-boat's periscope rose slowly from its position, and there, through the narrow lens, the crew caught sight of their prey, a convoy of Allied merchant ships, vulnerable and exposed on the surface. Another easy kill, the captain thought to himself, eyes narrowed behind the periscope. It was routine now, the same as all the other nights. A few torpedoes, a few explosions, a sinking ship, another success to report to the high command. The men around him were focused, their faces blank but taut with anticipation, well practiced in the deadly game they had played so many times. Their minds were calm, accustomed to the near-invisible threat of enemy aircraft or destroyers. The U-boat had always been the predator, the silent killer lurking in the depths. The first mate adjusted the sonar, eyes scanning the readout with practiced precision. A low, steady hum emanated from the machine, the sound of the sea washing through the hull. The first mate glanced up. No warning signals, no sign of anything unusual. The crew exchanged quiet nods. The convoy was oblivious. The U-boat moved silently, creeping closer to its target. The captain steadied his hands on the periscope, then looked down at his watch. 12 minutes until the strike. He gave a short order to the torpedo officer, who began the process of arming the weapons. The crew worked in seamless harmony, as if every movement was part of the same deadly ballet. Every man knew his role. Every task was automatic. Nothing could go wrong. Then, just as the captain prepared to give the final order, an odd sound cut through the air, the faintest crack. For a brief moment, it was drowned out by the sound of the U-boat's machinery. But something in the back of the captain's mind told him to listen more closely. He stood still, scanning the periscope, every instinct now heightened. His first mate looked over at him, an expression of confusion and concern forming on his face. The hum of the sonar was different now, sharper, louder. Something wasn't right. And then it happened. The first blast was so sudden and so violent that it felt like the entire U-boat had been struck by an unseen force. The hull shook violently, throwing the crew off balance. The captain's eyes widened in shock as he heard the unmistakable sound of metal, tearing a sound so loud it was as if the sea itself had reached up to grab hold of them. The Hedgehog. He realized, in a flash, what had happened. The sound he had heard was not an engine, not the usual hum of war. It was the first explosion of a Hedgehog shell, a salvo of depth charges slamming into the hull from ahead. His heart raced, and before he could issue a command, the ship was rocked again. This time, the sound of crumpling steel drowned out all other noise. Water surged into the lower decks. The floor trembled as the second explosion tore into the ship's belly, and for the first time in this war, the U-boat was on the receiving end of an attack it couldn't evade. In the control room, chaos erupted. The lights flickered as the electrical systems shorted out. The captain scrambled to issue orders, but his voice was drowned out by the rush of water flooding in. Panic spread through the crew. They had never faced anything like this before. Their confidence had been shattered in an instant. The sonar officer was frantically trying to make sense of the situation, but his screen was now a blur of static. The captain grabbed the intercom, but when he tried to speak, the words died in his throat. It was too late. Another blast. The water was rising, filling the compartment. The crew, once calm and in control, now fought for survival. Men were running, shouting, their training and discipline shattered by the ferocity of the attack. The captain watched in disbelief as the water level continued to rise. His mind raced, but there was no escape. His fingers moved toward the emergency ballast controls, but even as he did, he knew the truth. The U-boat was doomed. The Hedgehog had found its mark, and there would be no time to right the ship. The myth of their invincibility was over. Through the water-slicked windows of the control room, the captain saw the faintest light, the silhouette of an enemy ship looming overhead. But there would be no escape. The U-boat would never reach the surface again. His final thought, as the ship began to list to one side, was not of battle, but of how quickly everything could change. How the tide of war could turn in a single, fateful moment. And then, all at once, the sound of rushing water filled the room, and the U-boat was swallowed by the depths. The crew's final moments were marked by confusion, chaos, and a realization that their once proud vessel, their symbol of dominance beneath the waves, was now nothing more than a shattered wreck at the bottom of the Atlantic. By early 1943, the Atlantic War shifts from a duel of nerves to a system contest, and the side that wins is the one that can close the kill chain faster, cheaper, and more reliably than the other can adapt. That is exactly what the Allies build, while Germany's U-boat force bleeds time, crews, and industrial slack. And Hedgehog sits at the center of this shift because it rewrites the geometry of the attack. Instead of charging over a contact, losing ASDIC, and guessing a depth for a falling drum of explosives, an escort now throws a crown of contact-fused bombs ahead of her bow while maintaining sonar lock to the last second, which means no blind interval and no duck under the wake escape. The weapon itself is only one part. The rest is doctrine that makes every ship in a convoy an execution node, HF, DF, shore stations, pinch down the bearing of a night transmission, long-range radar on patrol aircraft forces, subs to submerge early and burn battery. Escort carriers push hunter-killer groups out beyond the convoy lanes, and within each group, the standard drill becomes contact, fix, attack, reacquire, in a tight loop, measured in minutes, not hours. The difference sounds small, but at boat level, it is fatal, because a submerged U-boat has a thin oxygen budget and a thinner maneuver. Envelope electric motors mean slow acceleration. Turning circle is broad, and every hard rudder eats battery that is needed later just to live. So when an ASDIC screen holds a steady range rate and the captain hears the dry bark of a projector up front, he knows there is no wait for the depth charge pattern to pass anymore. These warheads detonate only on contact, and if they miss, there is no concussive signature to mask the sonar picture. The escort simply corrects bearing and throws again. The Allies build procedures around that truth. 2-ship and 3-ship box attacks, where one vessel maintains the plot while the others cycle in to fire. Formalized range gates, for when to launch the first salvo, and when to switch to patterns, offset left or right of track. And a cold rule: never chase the wake. Always aim where the target must go next. The learning loop is brutal and fast because the system is set up to learn, with dedicated ASW schools ashore, with after-action signals that condense what worked into short, memorizable drills, and with industrial feedback that treats a good idea as something to be mass-produced like a fitting or a fuse. Production underwrites everything: corvettes, destroyer escorts, CVEs, sets of centimetric radar, miles of HF, DF wire, and thousands of Hedgehog projectors come off lines in numbers the German yards cannot hope to match. And that asymmetry changes behavior. An American escort can take risks because another hull can replace her. A German commander cannot squander crews because a trained boat's cycle time is measured in months and irreplaceable men. The operational picture narrows for the U-boat too, because air cover stretches outward. Very long-range Liberators, Sunderlands, and Catalinas seal the mid-ocean gap, and the moment a submarine is forced down in daylight, its situational awareness collapses to whatever the hydrophones can tell, and the stopwatch says about endurance, while up top, the escort group's situation awareness expands. A bridge team watching a clean PPI scope and a plotting table that keeps a running fix while ASDIC sings through the water. In that environment, Hedgehog is the decisive lever because it makes contact persistence profitable. The old depth charge run gave you noise and froth and a likely lost contact. The new ahead throw lets you keep the thread and pay it out into successive salvos that walk onto the hull. And because the bombs only explode on contact, the absence of an explosion is information, a quiet miss that tightens the bracket on the next run instead of blinding you. Logistics ties Doctrine to oceans: fuel for continuous patrolling, spare projector spigots, and fuses in forward depots. Standardized training films, carrier decks filled with Avenger crews, drilled to drop sonobuoys and coordinate with surface ships on set voice nets, and a convoy timetable that assigns specific hunter-killer groups to roam high-probability approaches before a convoy ever sails, forcing the U-boat to fight on the Allies' schedule. On the German side, the fix options thin out METOCs, and then newer receivers help for a season until centimetric sets erase the advantage. Snorkels arrive late and bring their own signatures. Acoustic torpedoes briefly disrupt, then Foxer gear soaks them off escorts, and every supposed countermeasure runs into the same wall. A boat under the surface is slower at turning data into action than a coordinated group above it with air eyes, radio bearings, and a weapon that does not require guesswork about depth. Decision-making reflects these fundamentals. Allied commanders push authority down to the escort screen to prosecute contacts without waiting on the convoy commodore. After-action learning is institutionalized in numbered memoranda that become tomorrow's drill. And the risk calculus assumes acceptable attrition because Detroit, Belfast, and Bay City can fill the pier again, while BDU, reading returns from battered crews, shifts from hunting to survival tasks, transit submerged. Avoid the bay where CVE groups lurk. Fire from outside the screen at night if weather and luck allow. And if an aircraft appears, dive and pray. When contact comes, the pattern is mechanical. HF, DF, fixes a chatter point from a contact report. The group steams to datum. Aircraft force the boat under. Ship ASDIC grabs the echo. First Hedgehog salvo goes at the computed intercept. No detonation means instant correction. Second salvo bites with a sharp series of metallic cracks. The echo breaks up. A brown stain and debris boil to the surface. Repeat that chain enough times, and a myth dies. Not by rhetoric, but by schedule. Math boats destroyed per month, exceed boats completed, and crews trained. Convoy loss rates drop, and the operational initiative flips so hard that the U-boat arms tasking becomes get out, report, live if possible, which cedes the Atlantic's pulse to the side that can keep a timetable. None of this says the weapon alone wins the ocean. Hedgehog is the sharp end of a system that includes intelligence, production, training, and permissive command philosophy. But its presence on a bow symbolizes the transition from probabilistic bombardment to deterministic kill. And that is why captains on both sides feel the change in their bones. Allied officers speak in timings and corrections because their tool rewards precision. German captains speak in whispers and silence because any transmission can draw a noose. By late 1943, the doctrine is mature enough that even average crews can execute it. Escort groups fan out. One holds contact. One fires. One guards the convoy. Aircraft stitch the gap, and the U-boats choose your moment. Advantage is gone. The psychology flips as well, for the simple reason that systems create emotions. When you know a contact will be held, and the weapon will meet it at the place geometry dictates, confidence becomes a habit. And when you know your boat cannot outturn a bracket, and your batteries are already half spent, caution hardens into fear. War at sea is decided by who can make their procedures cheap, repeatable, and lethal. And in the Atlantic, that means the Navy that can turn a bearing line into a wreck on the bottom before the other side can change the rules. So when the Hedgehog spigots slam up and the bow lurches, that is not just a shot fired, it is a system executing. And the outcome, more often than not in that year, is a silent sea, an oil smear, and a logbook entry that reads, contact prosecuted, explosions heard, debris sighted, convoy resumed, speed 12 knots.